right, well, good afternoon. I'm going to try to make this as exciting as possible for post-lunch. I know for me, especially post-lunch, there's a little bit of that fog, so appreciate you all being here and trying to make this as interesting as possible. So today's presentation is titled Leveraging Expert Consensus to Identify Barriers and Strategies to Build DE&I and Extension. And so this is a project that I worked collaboratively with my PhD student, Cody, Dr. Lendel, Narine from Utah State University, Colby, Silvert, who's another one of my graduate students, and then Dr. Jayaratne from North Carolina State University. So just a little bit of background on diversity, equity, and inclusion and cooperative extension. And we're seeing, especially recently, that DE&I is receiving a lot more attention and there's more focused efforts on promoting DE&I efforts and outcomes and extension. They're approaching this and designing it to help to address some of the long-standing issues with marginalized, underrepresented, underserved communities, in addition to all of those different diverse communities. So not only just based on race and ethnicity, but disability, gender, etc. Despite this increased attention, there's still a lot of challenges that we're facing. And there needs to be, if you look at the literature, there's a lot of research that shows kind of one-off surveys trying to identify what barriers and challenges exist, but there hasn't been a systematic and rigorous effort to come to agreement. And coming to agreement is a challenging component. So it's really easy to say, hey, these are all the challenges, hey, these are all the strategies, but really coalescing around some agreement on what is most pervasive is a challenge. It hasn't been done in the literature to date. So a little bit of a snapshot of DE&I in practice. So in the past, a lot of the DE&I work was centered around diversity action plans, and this is right around the late 1980s. Then we started to see some cross-institution commissions and strategic working groups through the 90s to help to improve not only the hiring practice, but client engagement. Unfortunately, with these types of efforts, it frequently failed to address some of the structural and systematic issues that related to racism, privilege, and power. And so this represents why there's been a recent shift. So the shift now is focused more on building intercultural competence so that folks are better able to understand themselves, navigate cultural difference, be more able to culturally assimilate so that they're able to provide more culturally relevant and responsive programs to all of the communities that they work with. So one of those specific outcomes is culturally responsive teaching and pedagogy that we see is picking up a lot of momentum. So what is the study purpose? So as I mentioned, there hasn't been really a systematic and rigorous exploration on what the most pervasive barriers are. So we wanted to identify what those are. In addition, we also wanted to have a frame of reference of some strategies that these DE&I experts have seen to work in their own field. So first, we want to determine if consensus is possible. So as we know, agreement is not always plausible, so can we come to agreement on these different ideas? Then determine the agreed upon barriers to DE&I extension, determine the agreed upon strategies for overcoming DE&I, for overcoming barriers to DE&I as an extension. And then the last one was phrased around, okay, if you can select only one single strategy to move the needle forward, what would that be? So those are the different areas that we're looking to achieve consensus around. So if anyone sat through one of my presentations before, they know I am a Delphi Technique person. So I leverage the Delphi Technique in this process. So it was a 3-round Delphi Technique, modified Delphi because we did it online, which is the most traditional means of doing Delphi studies, especially now when there's geographic dispersion. And then we use the construct of identifying barriers and essential practices. That's right in the wheelhouse of what the Delphi Technique is typically used for. So as I mentioned, questions were distributed via an online survey. The panel included around 11 experts. These 11 experts are the go-to people for DE&I across extension. So if you were to name someone, they were involved in this process. The first round was an open-ended elicitation round to just get everything out there, to create that comprehensive list. And then round 2s and 3 moved to a refinement and moving towards consensus. And that was around the different items that I mentioned. So for the barriers, we used an extent scale. So everything from not a barrier at all to a major barrier. And we used the a priori definition of consensus, 2/3 identifying it as a major barrier. And then the strategies, we used a 1 to 5 Likert type scale around effectiveness. So one being not effective at all, and then extremely effective. And then the second round, to give an opportunity to, again, move towards a comprehensive list, we provided the opportunity to insert through open-ended items. So if they were reviewing the list and felt like there was something missing, it gave them that opportunity to interject it at that point. So the results, as you can see, based on our a priori definition of consensus, we achieve agreement on 2 of the barriers. So one is all policies and procedures are designed to serve one traditional group of people, and the lack of diversity among extension professionals. So yes, we were able to achieve consensus, but only around 2 items, which, well, I'll talk about what that means later. So the strategies we achieved a lot more agreement around. So I'm not going to go through this list, but I will point to the top one, which I think is extremely salient, and I experience that all the time. So establish clear expectations with professional development opportunities, hiring procedures, programs, and reporting systems. I think within my own work, communicating clear expectations is something that especially those on-the-ground educators struggle to get. So making sure that there's a clear communication of what the expectations are across all of those areas is something that resonated with this group. And then, so these are the items that we achieved agreement on for the single strategy. So number 1 and number 2 were involvement of upper administration across the organization, and then purposefully hiring. The hiring process is something that I've heard throughout my own work. It's something that needs to be reevaluated, and this group, through this agreement process, saw the same thing. All right, so results, 100% response rate in the final round. So we had 100% response throughout all of our rounds, which is great. We had the 2 agreed upon barriers, which we mentioned earlier. And we really feel like because there was only 2 barriers that were identified, it gives an opportunity to really refine focus on how to address those barriers in a salient way. We had 18 agreed upon general strategies and 9 agreed upon single strategies. So the 2 pairs that reached a consensus are corroborated with the literature. When we went back into the literature, these are things that resonate over and over again. So the policies being for a traditional group, and then the lack of diversity among extension professionals. There are some contextual factors to take into place with those 2. So for example, diversity may need to look different depending on where you're at, what system you're at with, and what clientele you're serving. Given the variation of DEI engagement between extension and land-grant institutions, there needs to be a better focus of using these processes to identify barriers locally as well. So triangulating it with this national panel more locally to take into consideration some of those contextual factors. Since there is high levels of agreement across the strategies, and these folks are at the front lines of DEI work, we really feel like there's an opportunity for folks to have a menu of different strategies that may work for their own context and spark discussions on what's most relevant for their own institution. And then, since those strategies and outcomes were relevant for our context, again, there's an opportunity to replicate those to ensure that there's that connection and salience for those contextual factors that you're dealing with. So I mentioned the contextual factors multiple times, so I won't jump into that. What we're looking to use this data for is to connect it to understand organizational readiness for change across extension organizations. So this is one of those first steps, coming and coalescing around agreement for what are the barriers, and then figuring out, taking a temperature check, or where are folks at to address those different barriers. Further research using surveys or other kind of generalizable means will help to advance the measurement ongoing. So that's something at a national and international level. There aren't kind of go-to instruments to measure this progress around DE&I. So there's a need to understand how to evaluate these change-related efforts at an organizational, national, and international level. So what we're doing now is we're approaching that. And so we are using an organizational readiness for change construct and implementing it on a national level. We are partnering with the Extension Council on organizational policy to identify a construct to use, as I mentioned, that kind of systematic approach. So the survey will triangulate transformative leadership. So this survey will be administered among extension deans, It'll be administered among DE&I contacts and then program leads to understand at an administrative level what's happening. And so we will be using the transformative leadership construct, the National Association of Colleges and Employers, DE&I progress indicators, benchmarks, and outcomes, and then the Myers DE&I spectrum. And we'll be evaluating across all of the land-grant institutions to understand where leadership is, in addition to where the organization is. And it cuts across all of the different dimensions of DE&I. And so the final product is intended, so we will administer it, hopefully, at the end of the year to understand where we're at and develop a baseline, and then use that to, again, to continue to evaluate how we're moving forward to achieving DE&I in our own institutions, which, since we're in an international conference, has implications on when we work abroad. So if we're able to work with, for example, our immigrant populations nationally, then that gives us more of a foundation to work abroad more effectively and more in a culturally responsive manner. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Diaz. We're going to go ahead and open up the floor for questions. I'll start us off with a question.
Okay.
I'm curious about, you talked about your panel of 11 panelists, and currently right now we know that there's a lot of political diversity across the nation dealing with some of these issues, right, and what that looks like. And we could probably all sit for days and talk about what state we're from and what that looks like within our state.
Sure.
So I'm curious whether or not you think that the geographic dispersion of those 11 individuals might have influenced that, or what that might have looked like, and if that was something that kind of came about within your examination.
Yeah, so to give you some historical knowledge, so this 11-person panel was birthed out of a 35-person national panel. That 35-person national panel was the one that actually asked for this study. So we originally did an intercultural competence study to develop agreement on that type of model. And they came to me and said, well, if we're going to be able to implement an ICC framework, we need to understand the environment that we're working in. Mm-hmm. So that 35-person panel nationally sub-selected the 11-person panel to represent political diversity, geographic diversity, as much of the dimensions of diversity coupled with expertise. And so those 11 people were strategically selected for that purpose. And that's why one of the objectives was, can we even achieve agreement? Mm-hmm. So that's why the achievement of agreement is a win, and then solidifying what that agreement was around was also a win. So as we've seen recently, again, it's hard to agree on so many different things. So developing this agreement will help not only the 11-person panel, but the 35-person panel have some synergy around the work that we're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is a really interesting way to approach this because for everybody in the room who doesn't know, there's been a huge struggle with D&I stuff associated with extension from a very traditional field. And so my curiosity is, I think you do a really good job of looking at this from an individual perspective, particularly from maybe an administration perspective. A major part of the issue is culture and the traditional cultures that have been hiring practices.
Yep.
I mean, there's a variety of this, right? This comes from the more individual, what you're talking about is a little bit more individual. How do you see trying to encourage change through culture, because that's really the culture of extension within the different counties, within the different states, is a major, major barrier as to why things aren't changing. We're not just talking about D&I. Innovative techniques, I mean, there's a lot of change for extension is hard. So how would you apply it in that case?
So in our follow-up conversations to make sense of this data, that's where that first one came as a subset of those cultural dimensions. So because the culture propagated this policy framework from a historical lens of, okay, white Caucasian males, and that just continues to be propagated. So in having conversations that it was on the strategy list, having a task force to understand how these dimensions tie to those larger extension cultural dimensions that stymie change in general, right? And so that's been part of the organizational implementation side of things is, okay, these are very DE&I centric, but they can't be considered in a vacuum outside of those larger barriers that the organization is dealing with. So that's part of our implementation plan.
Other questions? I'll ask another question.
Sure.
I'm curious if, I know the Delphi Study is something that you do well, and a lot of people don't do it well. I think we've seen that out there in research, and I would be somebody, if I tried to do that I would not do well, right? So I was just curious if you could provide some advice that you have for carrying that out,
Yes.
or also provide the room with maybe some advice on when a Delphi study is most appropriate in their work.
Yeah, so I'm a very applied thinker and researcher, and I like to make sure that my research turns into action. And I see the Delphi technique as a means to build community within your research agenda. And so I started with research, with relationship building. So I identify my sampling frame, and then I reach out individually to each one of these folks to have a conversation. That elicitation phase of just having those conversations has resulted in, I think my lowest response rate on a Delphi study was 96%, and that was a Delphi panel of 135 people. So that initial investment of time on the front end has increased my response rate. And it's funny, I'll get Delphi stuff all the time, and it's someone I've never talked to, I have no idea who they are, and they're like, hey, we want you to spend hours of your time filling out a Delphi survey. So for me, as a matter of respect, I feel like it's worth my time to make that connection, because they're gonna then be spending lots of time. So for this study, the first one with the 35 members, they spent 6 hours across the 3 phases. So they were invested because of that initial call. So if you're gonna do a Delphi technique, invest that time on the front end, it'll be worth it. Because otherwise you're gonna be herding cats to make sure folks will respond to you. So, and it just keeps the integrity of the process. You don't have ebbs and flows of participation.
Absolutely. And we've all seen those studies that start out as 135 and the last round is like 20, right? So I think that that's really valuable advice.
Yep.
Other thoughts or questions?
So, to make this internationally scoped, a lot of times we think of things from an American-centric perspective, and I appreciate that you're trying to translate that. When you're talking about culturally relevant engagement, culturally relevant in the United States means something quite a bit different than culturally relevant in an international setting. So can you see how you articulate where this might go to even broaden the horizons from that perspective?
Yeah, so I mean, culturally relevant programs, whether they're in the United States or abroad, it's that same framework. It's understanding your audience, engaging them, being part of the process. And so with these folks that they're engaged in the process, they both do domestic and international work. And so it was just, hey, how do you serve diverse clientele regardless of where you're at? And this is what came to the head. And it was all really internally facing organizational issues that they were identifying, because to be successful in their work, they were struggling to navigate the organization that they were in. And so, again, if you're working with a Latino community in the United States or a Latino community in Mexico, there's those same dimensions that you need to consider to make sure that it's relevant for what they're doing. So that's what I would say in the same thing as well. Again, this panel's from the US. They were both considering national and international work, and that culturally responsive pedagogy or teaching framework is transferable. You've got to understand your audience and understand how they learn, how they want to engage with you, and who they are as a person. So,
well, thank you, Dr. Diaz, for your presentation.
Yeah.